Thank you to everyone for joining us. Welcome to the Ideas 42 Academy Seminar Series. My name is Mitra Salasel, and I'm the Director of Communications at Ideas 42. And on behalf of all of us at the team, thank you for tuning in to learn more about applying behavioral science to tough social problems. Today, we're joined by one of our newest academic affiliates, Professor Gabrielle Adams, Assistant Professor of Public Policy at the University of Virginia. Gabe studies the processes and dynamics that give rise to good decisions, policies, and conditions in organizations. Today, she'll be sharing insights from her most recent research on design and problem solving, which shows that when improving ideas, objects, or situations, people default to considering what they might add and only occasionally and effortfully consider what they could subtract. Before I hand it off to Gabe, just a small housekeeping matter. For those of you who may be new to our seminar series, we'll be taking questions through the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer as many as time allows at the end of the presentation. Feel free to drop the questions as they occur to you into that Zoom Q&A box, however, and we'll make sure we get to them. You can find that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. All right, without further ado, Gabe, over to you.
Great, thank you, Mitra, for that kind introduction. Hello, everyone. I am so delighted to be here to be giving this talk today. The title of my talk is about why people systematically overlook subtractive changes. And this is research I had a lot of fun doing with my collaborators, Ben Converse and Leidy Klotz, who are both professors at the University of Virginia, and Andy Hales, who was a postdoc at UVA when this started and is now a professor at the University of Mississippi. Our research actually started with an observation that we had about the world. And specifically, our observation was one we made about the way that people solve problems. So here's an example of a problem. Think about what's the best way to teach a child to ride a bike. And if you grew up in the generation that I did, you probably learned to ride on something that looked like this, or maybe something that looked like this, or even this. So you can see either a tricycle or a bike with training wheels or a bike with even a handle. And so more recently, we are thinking about nowadays how children learn to ride bikes. And several of my co-authors have young children, toddlers, and we are talking about how most kids these days learn to ride bikes on a balance bike. And so although most solutions in the past have entailed adding extra wheels or handles to help prevent children from falling over, the insight of the balance bike is that children actually learn to ride better and more quickly when they learn to balance. And the best way to do that is actually to subtract the pedals and the drivetrain and the gears. So notice that this is a really great solution to this problem about how best to teach children to learn to ride bikes. And it's one that was achieved, you'll see, by subtracting rather than by adding. Here's another example of a problem, right? So this is an intersection in a city called Poynton in the UK near Manchester. And urban designers, urban planners were tasked with trying to make this intersection safer. So if we think about how to make an intersection safer, most solutions might entail adding crosswalks or stoplights or road signs. But it turns out that accidents actually decrease when urban planners get rid of signs and barriers, right? So here, this is what the intersection now looks like in July 2015. And counterintuitively, removing these things can actually make intersections safer because they require drivers and pedestrians to make eye contact with one another and to communicate with one another. So these are examples of problems, and specifically design problems. And everyone designs, according to Herb Simon, everyone designs who devises courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. So everyone designs. If you take an idea, an object, a situation and you try to make it better, you are designing it. So design includes the work, the professional work of engineers and architects and urban planners and executives and teachers and even legislators and medical professionals. But it also includes the everyday uncredentialed work of parents and soccer coaches and caregivers, activists and bloggers and even hackers everywhere. All of these people, no matter their role, are trying to take something and make it better, which is a fundamental problem that we confront in our lives on a day-to-day basis. Design, therefore, also includes all kinds of problems and improvements, right? So we can try to make society better, try to advance technology, try to facilitate people's success. We try to improve products or experiences or policies. So we are often trying to just make things better. But we also design very mundane things, right? We wake up in the morning, we make avocado toast. How could we make that better? How could we improve our calendar? How could we improve the academic paper we're writing? How could I have a better workout routine? And so at the essence of problem solving is design, right? How does one try to take something and make it better? And sometimes the route to improvement has been well specified, but sometimes it is a not very well defined, it's an ill-defined problem, right? And when we specify, certain problems, we might specify the route by which we want to solve the problem. So if we want to say that we should make something bigger or faster or leaner or streamlined or to hone it, we're specifying how we expect the improvement to take place. But a lot of times improvement problems are ill-defined, which means that the initial situation and the allowable actions and the goals, what you're trying to reach, the end state that you're trying to reach, are not clear and you don't even know what they look like or what is allowed or permitted. So in our research, we investigate how people approach a variety of design problems. And specifically what we do is investigate whether people change or transform or improve something by adding to it versus by subtracting from it. And the way that we did this is we conducted a series of observational studies to examine the ways in which people transformed a wide variety of artifacts, so ideas and objects and situations. And our hypothesis was that people overall would broadly improve things by adding rather than by subtracting in these observational studies. So we conducted these studies both online and in the field. Each study included between 94 and 827 individual observations. Okay, so I'm going to run through just a list of the observational studies that we conducted as part of this research. In one study, we invited participants to make a design symmetrical from left to right and top to bottom in the most efficient way possible by removing a shape rather than adding three, right? So that would be the efficient solution. But when we gave people this problem and asked them to make it symmetrical, in a series of these patterns, 20% of people failed to erase these squares even once, right? And we made sure it didn't have to do with where the extraneous squares were. So we counterbalanced where that extra, series of green squares were in the grid. In another observational study that we conducted, we obtained data from an organization in which an incoming leader had solicited different ideas for how to improve it. And so we looked at all of the ideas that had been submitted about how to make the organization better, and we coded whether the ideas involved adding or subtracting. So some of the additive ideas included more study abroad grants or creating gender inclusive housing options. And some of the subtractive ideas included things like getting rid of legacy admissions at the organization, at the university. What we found in this study was that only 11% of participants suggested removing elements from the organization. The vast majority of ideas that were submitted entailed adding on features or characteristics or activities or programs, that sort of thing. In a third observational study that we did, we created a structure out of Lego bricks, and we put it out on a table at a university, and we simply asked people passing by to participate in a study, and we asked them to make it better however they wanted. What we found in that study is that depending on the structure, only between 2 and 12% of participants improved the structure by taking bricks away from it. The vast majority of participants here improved the structure by adding Lego bricks on. We did a study in which we asked people to summarize a newspaper article. And so most people are taught that writing can be improved by tightening or shortening whatever's been written. But when we asked people to edit the summary that they had written in order to make it better, we found out that only 17% of participants ended up with fewer words than they had started with. So even we know and are taught to subtract and to edit when we write, people still ended up with more words than they had started with. We also took those original essays, those original summaries that participants had written, and we gave them to a second set of participants and asked them to improve the summaries. Those participants were more likely to subtract if it wasn't their writing than if it was their writing, but they still also ended up with more words than they started with. Finally, we gave participants an itinerary for a day trip to Washington, D.C., and we invited them to make it better. The original itinerary that we gave them was jam-packed with 12 activities spread across 14 hours, but only 28% of participants removed activities from their schedule, which would make for a very busy day trip, you can imagine. So this is a series of observational studies that we conducted to just test whether, when given the chance to improve something, people tend to add versus to subtract. So the intent of these studies was to compare the rates of addition and subtraction. And although we did not randomly sample across transformation problems, we did observe this tendency to add or subtract across a broad range of goals. So, everything from Legos to itineraries to these patterns, these grids. These stimuli, of course, vary in how familiar they are to people and how important they are. So presumably, ideas to improve an organization matter much more than what Legos you would put into a Lego structure. So we do have a variety of stimuli that we are looking at, but we haven't systematically sampled stimuli here. And across all of these studies, the rates of subtraction were lower than the rates of addition, except when the artifact that we asked participants to transform had superfluous components. So what that means is when we gave participants an artifact that obviously had lots of extra stuff added onto it, people then were more likely to subtract. And we saw this in the case of a recipe for soup. We varied the number of ingredients that comprised this recipe and asked people to make it better. So the soup recipe either had 5 ingredients, 10 ingredients, or 15 ingredients. Participants were more likely to subtract from the recipe that had 15 ingredients than from the other recipes. People were also more likely to subtract when the artifact that we asked them to improve had these anomalous components that essentially called out for subtraction. And this is the case in a study that we conducted with recipes for grilled cheese sandwiches. There are things that obviously go hand in hand with grilled cheese sandwiches, like ham or tomatoes, but there are things that very obviously do not belong in a grilled cheese sandwich that are anomalous. So things like chocolate or sardines. And what we found is that people were more likely to subtract when the recipe was for a grilled cheese sandwich with chocolate or sardines than they were to subtract from a recipe for a grilled cheese sandwich with ham or tomatoes. So this led us to hypothesize that what might be going on here is a phenomenon known as subtraction neglect. And the way that we think about and define subtraction neglect is the argument that people basically default to considering what they can add and not what they can remove when they're trying to solve a problem or improve something. So why might this be the case? Our argument is that if people don't subtract, it's because either they didn't think of it or they didn't choose it. And when solving a problem, people conduct mental searches for possible transformations. So they think about the problem and they think about all of the things that they could possibly do. In order for people to subtract, they have to first think of a subtractive transformation and then they have to choose it, right? So those are two conditions that have to be met for people to select a subtractive transformation. First of all, they have to think of it and then they have to choose it. So there are at least two stages at which additive solutions might win out. First, because people aren't thinking of subtractive solutions, and second, they're not choosing them. So additive solutions essentially might win out because they're more psychologically accessible than subtractive solutions. And they also might win out at the selection phase, which would mean that people basically prefer or are more likely to select additive than subtractive solutions. So our experiments, which I am going to turn to next, are only going to look at this first part of the model, the search stage, but not the selection stage. Okay. So we focus on whether subtractive solutions come to mind as easily as additive solutions do at the search stage. We are not going to test the second stage of the model, whether people select a subtractive solution. So here we came up with paradigms where if people thought of a subtractive solution, they should be much more inclined to give it as their answer. And so as you'll see, we're going to use a variety of methodological approaches to isolate this role of psychological accessibility. And this also gives us an opportunity to look at contexts where if people are arguably making a mistake, it's costly because they are missing out on good solutions to problems. Right. So coming back to the balance bike example that we started with, bicycles have been around since at least the early 1800s. Why does it take so long for the idea of a balance bike, a subtractive solution, to be thought of and invented and commercialized? And the founder of Strider Balance Bikes, Ryan McFarland, actually describes his thought process his thought process is consistent with our hypothesis that people don't think of subtractive solutions. So McFarland says he's contemplating how best to design a bike, and he's thinking about how to help his child learn how to ride. And he says, when I got to the drivetrain, I realized this was the majority of the weight and complexity. And he paused for quite some time at this point until it finally occurs to him, could I simply remove it? Right. So notice that he's saying that it takes a while for the subtractive solution to come to him. And we think of this as a property of many subtractive solutions, that they take a while to come to people. So drawing on this observation, our experiments tested whether people are likely to think of subtractive solutions because they are less psychologically accessible. That is to say, they don't come to mind as quickly or as easily as other solutions. So here's our hypothesis, our predictions formally stated, which is that if people are initially inclined toward representing mentally additive solutions and only subsequently, occasionally, and effortlessly represent subtractive solutions, then what we should see is that when we give people a chance to conduct a longer, deeper cognitive search in their minds, that should increase subtraction. So if we remind them that it's an option, if we ask them to search for a variety of solutions in their mind to problems, to deliberate about possible solutions, then they should be more likely to come up with subtractive solutions. Conversely, if we put them under an increased cognitive load or cognitive strain, then they should be less likely to come up with subtractive solutions. We conducted a series of experiments with a variety of artifacts, including Lego structures, recipes, experiences, and designs. And so I'm going to talk about some of these next. In our first experiment, we asked participants to consider how best to renovate a Lego structure. So to study whether people think of subtraction when they search for possible solutions, we set up this problem. This is what the structure looked like, and we asked them to ensure that the structure would hold a brick a certain height off the table. And to measure that height for participants, we gave them this little stormtrooper figure and said that the brick needs to be held above this figurine's head. And notice that this structure is relatively unstable, kind of like a one-legged table. It's balanced precariously, and so wouldn't be able to hold a brick above the stormtrooper's head as it currently stands. And so we said, okay, so make it hold the brick above the stormtrooper's head. And we randomly assigned participants to one of two conditions. In the first condition, we gave them the instructions to improve the Lego project. And we said, you will earn $1 if you successfully complete this task. Each piece that you add will cost you 10 cents. Participants in the second condition were given the exact same information, but we added an additional cue that removing pieces is free and costs nothing. Now notice that this information doesn't actually communicate or require or request subtraction. This is just a subtle reminder that subtraction is a possibility, right? It only makes subtraction salient. It doesn't actually tell people to subtract. Here is one of the solutions to this Lego structure. This is a solution that would cost participants 30 cents because they're adding 3 bricks, but it would stably hold a Lego brick above the head of the stormtrooper. Here is the subtractive solution. This subtractive solution would leave participants with the full $1. Okay. So coming up with a subtractive solution here should lead to a better outcome. Participants being less likely to add bricks would end up earning more money, end up keeping the full $1. All right. So on the y-axis are the percentage of people in each condition who subtracted, who ended up with fewer Lego bricks than they started with. And on the x-axis is the condition to which participants were assigned. So we hypothesized that participants who were cued to consider subtraction would be more likely to do so. And what we found is that when participants were subtly cued to consider subtraction, they were more likely to remove bricks than participants who received no reminder. We also looked at the amount of money that participants earned on this task and found that participants were more likely to earn less money when they weren't reminded to subtract. So that suggests that people's tendency to neglect subtraction can leave them, at least in this case, financially worse off, in this case, earning less money than they could have. We conducted another experiment in which we asked people to list all of the ways that people might possibly transform something. So in the previous experiment with the Lego structure, we asked people to just come up with one solution, but here we gave people a brainstorming exercise. And then what we did is, out of all of the ideas that they came up with, we measured how prominent addition and subtraction were among these lists. So participants were again randomly assigned to either a control condition or a subtraction reminder condition. And they were given the following problem-solving tasks. So we told participants that they are the assistant manager of a miniature golf course and that the owner has been trying to improve the facility over the last few months. And we asked participants to make a list of all the different ways that they could improve this miniature golf course hole without spending a ton of money. We also manipulated the instructions received. So half the participants were cued to remember that they could add or subtract, and the other half were in the control condition. And we gave them 24 spaces for their ideas. They didn't have to list 24 ideas. They didn't have to fill them all out. We just asked them to come up with as many ideas as they could. So in the no condition, Q condition, we just ask participants to remember that you don't want to spend a ton of money, but in the Q condition, we ask participants to remember that you could add or subtract, but don't want to spend a ton of money. Now, you could imagine solutions such as adding a windmill or a bridge. You could also imagine, making the hole look a little more fun, turning it into a smiley face. But you could also imagine subtractive solutions. For example, getting rid of this barrier here or taking away the sand trap. So there's multiple additive and subtractive solutions that are viable when it comes to improving this miniature golf course hole. You can see here an example from one participant who gave the following set of ideas. This participant said, add a little moat around the hole, put a windmill in front and add a few bushes, and then make a little loop for the golf ball to go into like a racetrack. Elevate the hole so that miniature golf course players would have to shoot the ball uphill. And here's a solution from another participant who at first says, well, you could make a shortcut over the water or put a giant duck somewhere before the hole, but then also comes up with subtractive solutions. So getting rid of the red bumper, and then comes up with an additive solution. So having two holes, a penalty hole where if you get it in, you have to start over. So these are just kind of prototypical examples of the kinds of solutions that participants gave to this exercise. In the Q condition, people had at least one additive, 93% of people had at least one additive idea. And in the no Q condition, 95% of people had at least one additive idea. So the number of additive solutions is approximately the same across both conditions, which suggests that the Q didn't provide any additional information, right? It's not, people were already thinking of adding. But when we look at whether people identified any subtractive solution, the Q did help people come up with more subtractive ideas. Okay. So again, this suggests that the Q to add was essentially redundant information for participants. They're already considering it, but the Q did shift the number of subtractive ideas that participants were likely to come up with, which suggests that participants weren't considering subtraction. You can also see the increase in the number of subtractive ideas that participants came up with in the Q condition versus the no Q condition. This is a graph of the results. The empty blue shapes are the number of subtractive ideas, and the filled orange shapes represent additive ideas at the top there. And then the difference between the solid versus the dotted lines are the no Q conditions, and the solid lines represent Q conditions. And so on the x-axis, what you have is the idea order. So the order in which participants had included at least one type of idea as they were generating their lists. You can see that most people came up with an additive idea as their first idea, but as they generated more ideas, they were more likely to come up with subtractive ideas, particularly if they were cued versus not cued, particularly if they were reminded versus not reminded. All right. Finally, we wanted to design just a completely novel task for participants. So presumably people have some experience with miniature golf courses or with Lego structures. So we wanted to know, even in a meaning-free stimulus, would people still neglect subtraction? Okay. So in order to do this, we created a novel task for participants. And this was a pattern matching problem for participants that we administered online. And this is the basic method that we used. So we gave participants, a series of grids that looked like the one on the left. And we asked them to change that pattern shown in the grid so that it is perfectly symmetrical from left to right and from top to bottom using the fewest possible mouse clicks. Now note that these squares really have no inherent value, and that there are multiple ways to transform the pattern to make it symmetrical. The way that participants could transform a pattern is by clicking on a square, and it would toggle the square from white to green or from green to white. So participants could solve this problem either by adding that same pattern in the other three quadrants or by removing the pattern in the upper left-hand quadrant. But if you were doing the task correctly, solving it in the fewest possible mouse clicks, then the correct subtractive transformation is to remove the pattern in the upper left-hand corner. So we used a couple of methods to study subtraction here. What we did is we allowed people to come up with a variety of solutions, allowing them to naturally discover or stumble upon subtractive changes. And in another set of studies, we basically put participants under increased cognitive load and asked them to solve these problems, hypothesizing that they would be less likely to come up with subtractive solutions when under cognitive load. So in this first study that we did with this grid task, we gave participants an opportunity to run through 3 practice trials, hypothesizing that if they had a chance to practice, that they would stumble upon a subtractive solution and would be more likely to give that subtractive solution on the focal trial. So in the practice condition, they did three practice grids before the focal grid. And in the no practice condition, they did not have a chance to stumble on the solution. They did no practice whatsoever. When participants were given the time and space to stumble upon a subtractive solution, they were more likely to generate it and to give it as their final answer. When we put participants under cognitive load, again, we're hypothesizing that they should be less likely to come up with subtractive solutions. So the way that we put participants under cognitive load is that we ask them either to keep their head still or to do a task concurrently at the same time that they were solving the subtraction grids. So asking them, for example, to move their head in a controlled fashion around in a circle. So we gave them the instructions for the task. We asked them to follow this pattern with their head or not. And then we looked at the average number of trials on which people subtracted. So the y-axis represents the average number of trials. And confirming our hypothesis, participants were less likely to subtract when they were under higher cognitive load. All right. So we are really interested now in understanding why subtractive solutions might be less cognitively accessible. And in my mind, there are at least 3 reasons why this might be the case. The first is that subtractive solutions might be more difficult to process, right? So for example, children have a harder time learning to do subtraction than addition in school. And any component that could be subtracted, you have to first understand it as part of the artifact, part of the thing that exists before you can consider it as not part of the thing that exists. And so that's harder to understand. The mental calculus there is more complicated for subtraction than it is for addition. You have additional steps there. Okay. A second reason why subtractive solutions might be less accessible, people might have this implicit positive association with adding and perhaps a negative one with subtracting. So for example, numerical concepts of more and higher and greater might be associated with, for example, something that's more positive or understood as better. And maybe there are cultural or evolutionary reasons for that. Finally, people might be rewarded more for adding, which would give people a sense of purpose. To the extent that it gives people a sense of purpose, it reinforces the strategy to add and not to subtract. It might make people feel a sense of accomplishment or self-efficacy. And over time, they do it more, they're rewarded for it, and it essentially becomes habit or practice. And it might bleed over from, say, one domain to the other. And consistent with this, people have to essentially add in order to create something. And so, in the process of creating something, do we learn to add? And then that sort of becomes a part of how we also improve things. We have no evidence right now for any of these. This is all just conjecture, and something that we are certainly really interested in studying. In future research, I talked about this two-stage model. Do we consider a subtractive solution in the first place? Do we even consider subtraction? But then also, do we select subtraction? Do we actually prefer subtractive solutions or additive solutions to subtractive solutions? And so that's something we would also like to explore in future research. One might imagine that there are a variety of mechanisms that underlie both stages of the model that are either psychological and or cultural or even socio-ecological in nature. So for example, you might look at the cultural variability of subtraction rates or try to understand, what it is about our history and our evolution as human beings that contributes people to either neglect subtraction or to choose or prefer additive solutions. Likely a model that is familiar to many of you, Lewin's field theory. This is a very basic theory of behavioral change that essentially posits that when we want change to occur, we can add impelling forces, but we can also remove barriers to change. So for example, making healthy snacks easier to reach by putting them at eye level relative to unhealthy snacks, which we might put those on a higher shelf. We don't have any evidence in this research that people try to change more through the adding of impelling forces than by subtracting constraining forces, but we do think that this is an interesting future direction for this research. And we note that many people, maybe behavioral scientists, are famous because they remind people essentially to subtract, right? So the whole idea of nudge, the whole idea of simplifying things, those are reminders to take away or to subtract from what currently exists. And even Marie Kondo, has put out this idea that we should tidy up, we should get rid of whatever does not spark joy. So consistent with this, it seems like we need reminders to subtract and that those are useful reminders to people. Okay. So when we think about the implications of this research, one of the things that I'm fascinated by is that we might be missing out on subtractive solutions, and that might potentially be costly, right? And so unless people are able and willing to think harder and are motivated to think harder and given the space to do so, we might be missing out, or they might be missing out on subtractive ideas. So what could we do to help with this? Well, we might, for example, remove barriers to coming up with subtractive solutions. Can we take away the pressure, the stress, the cognitive load, especially at the idea generation or brainstorming phase of projects? Could we encourage people to generate not just one idea and to stop when they reach an idea that satisfies the parameters of a problem, but to come up with lots of ideas, one brainstorming, and specifically ideas in which, as they do so, they might stumble upon subtractive solutions. So can we solicit subtractive ideas? Can we motivate people to come up with subtractive ideas? And then finally, how might we restate problems to get people into more of a subtractive mindset or frame of mind? So instead of saying improve, could we say things like hone or whittle or streamline? In defining the problem, can we say what kinds of solutions we might consider or think of or look at? So our intent with this research is to speak to big problems by studying small problems. And some of the ways that the research team, Ben, Leidy, Andy, and I have been putting this into practice in our own lives include trying to improve productivity by not doing things. So my colleagues and I have a no bell that we ring to encourage each other to stop doing things or to say no to certain requests for help that will, overburden our calendars or our schedules. We should probably get better at making stop doing lists relative to to-do lists. And if we stop neglecting subtraction, then hopefully people will spend less money on things they don't need. They will become more efficient in how they solve problems, and they will potentially stop contributing to excess waste, which could down the line lead to an even more sustainable planet. So I'm delighted to have had the opportunity to share this research with you. The link for the paper will be provided today. If you're interested in reading more, my colleague Leidy Klotz has written a really fantastic book that tells the story of this research and gives lots of really great examples of subtraction. And so I think we can also provide a link to that book today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabe, Professor Adams, for sharing all of this with us. We do, as promised, have some time for questions, and I believe we will definitely be sharing links to both the book and the paper in the chat today, as well as in the email that we'll be sending out with the recording of this session to all of you. So if you have questions you've been thinking about during the presentation, go ahead and drop them into the Q&A box. I'll give you all a few seconds to type those in. We do have a couple ready. So we will start with a question about testing the second part of the model. One of our participants is just curious about why you hadn't tested it at this point. Was it because you didn't have time, or were there other constraints?
So yeah, great question. We are really interested in doing this. We simply have not yet done it. We have not had time. So in the original paper, there's something like, I think, 20 studies in terms of the split between experiments and observational studies. And so what we wanted to do is concentrate our research efforts in one area. And that area we thought would first be establishing that people don't think of this. And so next we could turn our attention to why is it possible that people actually prefer additive solutions to subtractive solutions, even when they do think of subtractive solutions. So it's mostly been a time and attentional resources kind of issue for us, but we're really excited to do that.
Great, thank you. We have another question. Do you plan to test the various possible explanations for why subtractive solutions are less accessible?
Yeah, we do plan to do that. And some of those lend themselves better to testing than others. So for example, it's really hard to test evolutionary explanations for things in an experimental way, but we're certainly interested in pursuing some of these mechanisms. One of the initial tests or studies that we're looking at conducting is one that looks at the cultural variability of subtraction neglect. And so in an initial study that made it into the paper, we ran the grids task in the US, but also with student samples in Japan and Germany. And our sample size is really too small to be able to draw conclusions about, how much this varies across cultures. But what you do see is that there is some variability in subtraction, and in the extent to which participants neglect subtraction across these cultures. But actually you see more variability within cultures than you do across cultures thus far. But when I talk to people about this research, people often give examples of countries that they think will be less likely to neglect subtraction. And in the same breath, people often say to me, oh, but I bet in the US, where you just have so much stuff and, excess, that that's a culture that would neglect subtraction. But we don't actually have any evidence for that. And I think that that's a testable hypothesis. And we've heard from multiple people that they'd be interested in understanding that.
Great. We've still got a little, we have one more question here, but a reminder to everyone else, we've got a little bit more time. So if there are any burning questions you've had in your mind, please don't be shy. Go ahead and drop them into the Q&A box. We do have one more at the moment. Do you plan to draw more attention to your research, especially around governments?
Yes. I don't know that we will, it's hard as academics. I'm open to drawing more attention to research. Let me I think I'm having that.
Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Great. I am really open to drawing attention to this research. We're not specifically seeking out government agencies right now and saying, hey, let's go in and get rid of, excess waste and bureaucracy and that kind of thing. But I think there are many places where people do see the potential for this research to have impact, specifically with respect to the laws that people make and the policies and procedures that get implemented. And so I would love to see this research have impact across a wide variety of domains.
Great. Once again, just another call for participants. If you have any burning questions, go ahead and drop them into the chat. We have a few more minutes. Otherwise, we can give you all a few minutes back in your day. But while I'm giving you a chance to put in any last minute questions, just a reminder again that we'll be sending a recording of this session to each of you. We've dropped the materials that Gabe has mentioned, both the book and the paper, which I believe is open access, into the chat, and we'll be emailing it. And if you think of any lingering questions after this hour has come to a close, is there an email address that our participants can reach you at directly?
Sure. So you can reach me at gadams@virginia.edu. And I would love to hear more about your thoughts and reactions to the work today. I see a lot of basically implications for this when it comes to behavioral design. When we design interventions or we think about nudges or what we could do, we also want to make sure that we're considering what people could stop doing. We also want to make sure that we ourselves are thinking of subtractive kinds of interventions. So what could we do less of that might encourage then a specific behavior that we want to see? So I'd love to hear your thoughts and reactions to those ideas and any others that you may have had as you were listening to the presentation today.
Great. We have a couple more questions that have come in. First, how would you suggest that real-world program designers best prompt subtractive design during their own design processes? And kind of like a follow-on to that, are there any resources or best practices that you know of that would be useful to those of us that maybe are part of firms that that do a lot of design constantly?
Yeah. Absolutely. Depending on what kind of program design you're talking about, I think what our research suggests is, giving people reminders to subtract would be a good first step, and then also giving them space. So, removing things that create cognitive load, giving them time to stumble upon subtractive answers. So when it comes to designing a program, during the brainstorming phase or during the part of the project where you're thinking of how can we make this really, really good, whether it's a product or a program, making sure that you are soliciting all of the ideas, and specifically soliciting ideas for things that you could get rid of. Subtraction is not chronically accessible, right? We have to make it, therefore, momentarily accessible. So specifically asking for those kinds of ideas is one solution. And then again, giving them space to stumble upon subtractive solutions, not just going with the first answer that kind of satisfies the conditions or the parameters set forth, but saying, what else is possible? So just from our research, those are two of the things that spring to mind.
Thank you. What is your favorite theory as to why subtraction is harder than addition?
Subtraction is harder. I think, I'm specifically interested in this research has really focused on why subtractive ideas don't come to mind. And I'm interested in kind of the micro foundations of that idea, which is the extent to which it is learned. It's something that we have developed over time and learned as humans. And to me, that would suggest that children might differ from adults in terms of how likely they are to subtract. And so one of my favorite theories that I'm currently considering right now is if you give children versus adults an opportunity to subtract, are children perhaps less wedded to what already exists, or do they somehow come up with creative or subtractive or different kinds of solutions than adults do, which would suggest that this is something that is learned, perhaps in school or certainly as one grows up. And so that's one way that we could possibly test, whether subtraction is a learned behavior, and one that is so learned and so embedded that we don't actually think, we don't think of subtraction as a possible solution as adults.
Do you see any potential connections between this and loss aversion?
Yeah, I do. I think loss aversion is really distinct. So this research is meant to say, we don't think of it. Loss aversion would come in at the second stage of our model, and it would be one mechanism for why we don't choose subtractive solutions, right? Because we are averse to, losing what already exists, and so we don't want to take away. But our research is about the fact that people don't think about it in the first place. Right, so they don't, when considering how to improve something, we might be averse to losing something, but we also might not even think of the subtractive solution in the first place.
Okay, we've got one more question. It's much more specific. An anonymous attendee asks, in the Lego structure brick test, was there a group that was simply told that completing the task would earn them $1 and not told that adding pieces would cost them or removing pieces would cost nothing? And if not, was there a particular reason why not?
Yeah, so in that task, the two conditions were either adding pieces would cost them 10 cents, or they were given that exact same information and they received this additional, tiny bit of information, removing pieces would cost nothing. So the reason we did that is that adding pieces, we thought that would essentially be redundant information across both conditions. So we're holding the adding pieces information constant across both. And then when we have the information about removing pieces, that should be the novel thing to participants that would get them to consider something that they hadn't already thought of. So if they're already thinking of adding, that information is essentially redundant across both conditions.
Thank you. So we've got 3 minutes left. Last call for any questions anyone has about this research or for our guest, Gabe. And while we are giving everyone a few seconds to jump in, if they have not already, I just want to thank Gabe for spending time with us, sharing insights from your work and answering the questions of our participants. And thank all of the participants for joining us today and for submitting your thoughtful questions. If you're interested in learning more about the fundamental principles of behavioral science and starting to think more about how to apply it in your own work, our remote crash courses in behavioral science are resuming in December of 2021. It's 2021, not 2020. It all feels the same. But take a look at our Academy coursework and upcoming events, and of course recordings from both this and past seminar series installments, all at ideas42.org/academy. And if you think of any questions, again, you can reach out directly to Gabe. If you want to give people that email address one more time, actually, if you don't mind dropping it into the chat, I think that would be be very handy. Otherwise, you can reach out to Ideas42 as well by emailing academy@ideas42.org. No further questions have jumped in, so I think we can go ahead and close this out. Thank you again to our presenter, and thank you to everyone for your time. And we'll see you next time in the Ideas42 Academy.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Take care, everyone. Thank you.